decreased levels of new drugs being introduced. So in unearthing all this data from the 1980s, I came across this truly magisterial report by a woman named Maki Nomura. She's now a business professor at Cardiff University, but she was in the PhD candidate on School of Economics during her PhD dissertation titled, quote, Unrealized Potential, Japan's Post-War Pharmaceutical Industry 1945 to 2005. And as she writes in this truly excellent piece, quote, the biennial price reductions had a particularly severe impact on Japanese pharmaceutical firms' incentives to invest in R&D. As she elaborates, drug prices were revised uniformly on a regular basis, regardless of innovative value, throughout the patent protection period. These reductions incentivized Japanese firms to launch a new stream of drugs with short product life and little innovative value that could recoup the cost of R&D, rather than invest in more substantial innovation. While the industry did intensify its R&D location, most firms invested less than many American and European firms. This hindered the industry's prospects of launching breakthrough drugs that would have been more competitive overseas. As she writes in the conclusion of her 350-page dissertation, quote, as Japanese pharmaceutical firms were not able to profit from free market prices for pharmaceutical innovation, many firms preferred to minimize their investments in R&D. Moreover, the capping of drug prices not only resulted in smaller profits, but also limited the ability of firms to pursue riskier, costly, or sophisticated investments in R&D. What's the point of this? The point for the United States, for Japan, for European policymakers, is that stringent drug price controls, by capping the ability of companies to earn revenues, not only diminish their incentives to invest in risky innovation because they can't realize revenues from this investment, but it also diminishes their ability to invest in innovation because you have the profits to be able to do so. So stringent drug price controls reduce both ability and incentive and really disrupt the economics of biopharmaceutical innovation. So then you see that propagating throughout the entire system. If we look at the evolution of Japanese enterprises' investment in R&D in the biomedical sector, what we see is that Japan's share of global biopharma R&D fell by 1/2 from 1987 to 2018. Can't make money, can't invest in R&D. Can't invest in R&D, what happens? Well, the level of Japan's publications of biomedical scientific publications declined by 16.5% from 2000 to 2018. Their level of patents declined by 7% from 2000 to 2015. And when the biotech revolution really started to get done up, Japan was quickly behind, especially by the United States. A key reason why that was, by the way, is Japan's really suffered over time from underdeveloped industry university linkages. This is data from 2019 that looks at average industry funding for academic researchers. And you see that Japan invests barely 1/6 of a country like Germany and Korea. There was a significant gap in the share of GDP invested in this industry university R&D relationship between the US and Germany over really a 3-decade period. And so what you will find is that today startups only account for 2% of new drug innovation in Japan compared to in the United States, where about 70% of drug candidates currently in phase 3 clinical trials are being put forward by small companies. So overall, just 4% of new university-developed technologies are licensed to startups each year in Japan, whereas that rate is 70% in the United States. So over time, especially as universities were the focal point of the biotech revolution in the United States, and you have the ability to invest in university R&D and spin off into companies, Japan's largely that Japan to improve upon going forward. Okay, well, what happens? Well, in Japan, kind of in the late 2000s, sees that the industry follows the PMP pricing industry. And the goal here is to price, create a stable and reliable pricing environment for life science innovators, encourage R&D and innovative drugs by enabling companies to recoup their development costs before the launch of generics and invest in R&D. A wonderful paper by Shoyo Shibata, which analyzed the reward system in 2016, found, quote, the reward system works well and should be continued to encourage pharmaceutical companies to conduct clinical trials, thereby delivering more innovative drugs. All right, so what happens? Well, it appears to work. After 2012, we see a bump in the industry. See a significant increase in industry sales from about 2010 to 2017. And when you look at new drugs approved in Japan, new active ingredients, what you see is that this number increased by 72% from 2010 to 2016 compared with the percentage change over the previous 5-year period. So the PMP seems to be having an effect in spurring the industry. Unfortunately, as Japan's budget situation deteriorated in 2016, the Ministry of Health, Labor, and Welfare introduced new pricing policy reforms that effectively adjusted the biennial price survey to an annual cadence to create additional budget savings. These revisions dramatically reduced the number of patent medicines that were recognized as innovative for the PMP qualification. Overall, Japan by 2022 had implemented more than 50 drug price cutting mechanisms over the past 5 years, cutting drug prices nearly 20%. The 2023 off-year drug price revisions are expected to result in additional price cuts of 48% listed products across multiple therapeutic areas. So price cuts continue to this day. What's the impact? Well, when you look at the country's share of early stage pipeline drugs across US, Japan, China, and Korea, we see that since 2015, Japan has experienced a downtick both in their share of early stage medicines overall and oncology drugs as well, which have decreased by half. And so there's some evidence that these PMP revisions have had a deleterious impact on the country's ability to bring through innovative biomedical innovations. Okay, so where does this all leave us today? And what are some policy recommendations for Japanese and global policymakers in life sciences? I think first, we would advise and counsel policymakers to truly recognize the power and potential of Japan's life sciences sector to drive innovation, productivity, economic employment, and tax growth. Today, Japan employs 140,000 individuals directly in biopharmaceutical jobs. We know that this has been one of Japan's most successful sectors in the past. There's no reason, just like semiconductors and automotive electronics today, that it cannot retain and regain its status as a world-leading competitive Japanese sector. Second, we encourage policymakers in Japan and the US and elsewhere to recognize that far from being a driver of healthcare system costs, innovative medicine at the University of Columbia, where he looked from 1997 to 2010 at the value of reductions in work loss days and hospital admissions attributable to pharmaceutical innovation, and found that it was 3 times larger than the total cost of new drugs consumed. Innovative medicines can help solve societal problems. And if you look particularly in an aging society like Japan, issues of mental health, dementia, Alzheimer's, the MHLW projects that the cost of dementia will increase from 14.5 trillion yen to 24.3 trillion yen by 2060, with 50% of the cost of care being borne by families and 100,000 citizens having to leave Japan's workforce each year to provide care. We need to tackle that problem with innovative solutions like the Alzheimer's, which innovative companies are investing in. So that's part A. Part B is to balance the contributions that need to be borne by all actors in managing healthcare system costs in Japan. Unfortunately, as I understand, often the budgetary costs are directed more to the innovative biopharmaceutical sector. For instance, of the total 720 billion yen reduction in Social Security related expenses, Japan anticipates for the coming 5 years, 82% of that, or 594 billion yen, is to be drug price related. Share the cost among all actors in the system. Finally, recognize that companies really have to earn revenues to sustain innovation. And transparency and predictability in drug pricing is key for investment. The situation in Japan, where the prices for on-patent drugs decline faster than other countries in R&D investment, cannot be fully recovered. Makes the market less attractive than other countries for to launch new drugs, which is why the drug launch lag has accelerated in Japan over the past decade and has a negative impact on Japan's fairly involvement. I think policymakers also need to develop a comprehensive strategy to bolster the sector's competitiveness and manage that with overall drug pricing issues. So, in conclusion, what are some lessons for global policymakers? There was a great article done by Kimberly Cleaves in Modern Drug Discovery, where she's looked at the impact of European drug price controls on their industry over the past couple of decades. And what she concludes, quote, is that Europe's free ride is not free. European drug price controls actually led to considerable, quote, social and economic costs in Europe in the form of delayed access to drugs, poorer health outcomes, decreased investment in research capabilities, and a drain placed on high-value pharmaceutical jobs. Most countries want to have their cake and eat it too. They want to have low drug prices, and they want to have a competitive drug industry. It's time for policymakers to realize that you can't have both. You have to balance the interests of both parts of the equation. And in a context where globally, policymakers are calling upon the global public to make sacrifices and investments in global challenges like climate change, we can't expect countries should not be free riders on biopharmaceutical innovation. Countries need to step up, invest in R&D, and adequately value innovative medicines that are producing value for citizens around the world. So thank you. And with that, I am going to turn it over to our panelists for remarks. Joe, go ahead.
Thank you, Stephen, and thanks. Congratulations on such an excellent report. Sure, and carefully. I'm going to give a perspective now from someone who's been involved with Japan pharmaceutical policy for 22 years now. I barely believe it's been that long, and who's lived through some of the changes that you talked about, Stephen. Some for the better, many for the better, and some of the adverse effect. And to draw some lessons about that, what I've seen in terms of the Japanese policy-making system, and some lessons for them and for others. By the time I started working on this in the early 2000s, 2001 in fact, it was clear that they were lagging behind the American and European pharmaceutical sectors. In fact, the 1990s, which just ended, was a blockbuster era really began. You know, there were some big products, big companies at large scale, and Japanese companies really did not participate in that at all. They were very inwardly looking. Japan, and their profits were basically based in their home market. There were a couple of exceptions, but not very big ones. The biggest Japanese company at that time, similar to today, was probably 15th or 20th in the world. As a result of that, the innovative industry really began to work intensively to talk to the Japanese government and to the US government, by the way, about how they were lagging behind, how it was having an impact on access to medicines in Japan under their national health insurance system. We worked a lot, by the way, with the US government at that time. We were able to show, and this some of the points that Stephen makes, the system was basically designed, it was basically protectionist. It wasn't overtly protectionist in terms of high tariffs, but basically it's systematically discriminated against innovative products. We're getting very high prices for off-patent products, sometimes 70% of what the originator price was, which was dominated by Japanese companies, thus, surprisingly, and relatively low prices then for the originators. Well, if you can make 70 in this industry, which is very risky and takes a long time to develop a product and is very expensive, you can make 70% of the revenues without having to innovate, without having to risk on research and development, you will. And hundreds of Japanese companies did, and it is resulting in them not being particularly innovative. And Japan was not spending less on drugs; they were just spending on old drugs, where at that time something like 80% of the revenues of spent on medicine were in the generic sector, where in the U.S. it's always been the mirror image of that. As a result of a lot of this effort, and as I said, we were able to characterize this as a mode of domestic policy that discriminated against foreign companies, but also that was hurting their own industry, which was quite evident. Japan did start taking a number of reform measures, and they started earlier than the pricing reform, started in the early 2010s, as Stephen accounted. First, they had to close the drug lag. People forget that there was a significant one. Japan had an antiquated, non-aligned drug regulatory agency. In fact, it had two drug regulatory agencies. You might not remember that, which they combined which were understaffed and which made it much easier for Japanese companies to get products that were very difficult for Western companies. They combined the agencies, they created user fees, they increased the staff to review drugs, and by today, now that drug lag in terms of approval time between the FDA or the EMA approves a drug in the United States, Europe, and Japan has pretty much been closed. That's good news. In the early 2010s, as I'll get to in a second, they started pricing reform because they realized that there was very little incentive built into their system, which was the market for Japanese products for Japanese firms was in Japan. If you weren't getting rewarded in that market, you weren't getting rewarded anywhere really. In addition, they started to consolidate later their research and their government-sponsored research into biomedical science. But in short, I think the key here, and Steve, you touched on this, is that there was a holistic strategic approach in terms of improving the industry's ability to compete globally and innovate. It was regulatory, it was pricing, there were also some improvements in intellectual property rights, it was research and development. And in fact, in 2012, when the United States started negotiations on the ill-fated TPP, the industry at that time, the American industry, really didn't feel there was a bit of a division. But the issues were serious enough to raise as major issues in the TPP negotiations, whereas they had been raised in Korean negotiations and Australian negotiations earlier in the decade. That's how much things have improved by. As Stephen noted, on the pricing side, they did put in place this price maintenance premium, which was a premium for innovative drugs, but also maintained the price of your drug, relatively speaking, over the life of the patent, so that you could get a return on your investment. And that helped create a certainty for companies to invest and do research and development in Japan, as Stephen said, began to work. But then, after 2017 or so, some of these policies began to be reversed, particularly by the Ministry of Finance, as was noted. In particular, it started to become a lot more reactive to developments in the marketplace, like unanticipated drugs that became big sellers, and that had line extensions. In other words, they were approved for new indications. Apparently, even though these drugs were treating more and more people and were proving more innovative than even their developers had thought initially by getting new indications, the Ministry of Finance thought to actually punish that innovation by telling you, oh, more people like this drug, it's actually more effective than you thought. You know what? It's worth less to us than it was before. That's a great way to disincentivize innovation. In addition, the lurching that was starting to be created by, okay, there's a big product this year, so now we're going to invent a new mechanism to deal with that, and some new indications on these products the next year, created a lot of policy uncertainty for the sector. And then, on top of it all, they began to limit this price maintenance premium, and that may sound like not a fairly benign thing, but they started to show their sort of protectionist roots again. In other words, if your ability to get that premium was linked to how many products you either launched in Japan or initiated in Japan. Well, I was working at the Biotech Association. 70% of all the new products in the US are initiated by small companies. Guess how many of them have previously launched products in Japan? 0. So how many of them are going to get these price maintenance premiums in Japan? None. And if you're trying to promote a biotech collaboration and the fact that this industry is again changing, and this is another theme I wanted to bring out, was Japan continued to sort of lag behind changes in industry structure, okay? This big ecosystem of biotech industry, small biotech companies doing all of this innovative research and development was a relatively new phenomenon. It really took off in the early 21st century. Partnering with those companies and forming their own ecosystem like that in Japan would have been the thing to do, but they were still sort of stuck back in the 90s when we had the industry was dominated by these big companies. Finally, the final nail in the coffin, or one of them, was that they started to introduce annual price cuts. You can say, well, what difference does that make? You cut every year, every other year, prices so that that. But and without going into too much detail about the Japanese system, the point here is the price cuts were based on the difference between what a wholesaler sells to, say, a hospital at, and what the set reimbursement price was. And if there's a gap between what the wholesale sells to the hospital, that gap is closed. Well, guess what? That gap is that's the money the hospital makes on the drug. They're buying it cheaply from a wholesaler, and then they're selling it to the patients at some profit. And if you lower the price, you know what happens? You have to continue to give that gap to the hospitals to get a sale there. So every year now, you're creating this downward cycle of drug pricing after they're launched. And it's going twice as fast. The curve is it's twice as steep as it was before. So what did this do? As I think the data shows, it all had the impact of undermining local innovation. In some ways, they tried to promote. There was some great innovation. Japan's always had great science to give special benefits to the regenerative medicine sector, especially if you're launching your regenerative product in Japan. My comment on that is fine, but once again, it's reactive. It's saying, where do we actually have a lead? And then we're going to reward them after they already have the lead, as opposed to saying, well, maybe we should give these incentives to other sectors so that we can develop a lead, or can develop some incentive in those markets. So once again, they go back to this reactive approach, focusing on one sector in the innovative portion of the industry at which they were happened to be competitive. And if you were an American company or a foreign company, if you happened to be in that sector, you might get some benefit from it. If you weren't, you might not. I want to say that, clearly, I'll finish with a couple of quick comments. Clearly, Japan has got some serious problems in terms of, demographic problems and health and social problems in dealing with how are they going to pay for medicine, how are they going to give people access to the most advanced medicine. Aging society, still relatively slow economic growth. The industry has been continues to point out for years and years that there are some solutions to this that they have not really gone all in on yet, including continuing to make generics as cheap as they are in the US, say, and other long-listed products, which is another way of generics, but they're branded in Japan, to lower the prices on those. Japan has not wanted to hurt too much the industry that it does have. So by protecting the industry it does have, it's being prevented from getting the industry that it kind of should have, which is this innovative, world-leading technological sector. It's hard to have both. They've also not looked at the changes that are happening. As I said, this cohort of small companies doesn't exist in Japan. There are a few, there's a little bit of venture capital, but they've really not done a lot to develop that. In addition, and this is what worries me, they're not looking at the new technologies, and the system that's designed is really designed with some of the older technologies, whether they be chemical drugs, what we call small molecules, biologic drugs even. The future, and the future for a technologically advanced company like Japan, should be things like gene and cell therapy and gene editing. Okay, those are different types of products, and they have different, and they're going to be very difficult to reimburse unless you have a good plan in place. It's going to be very difficult to incent people to actually, or companies to develop those products. They have small populations. It requires a lot of focus on patients. And I don't think the Japanese system is really designed that well. And I think to do that, and what I think the result is going to be are gaps in access to some of these new medicines and a lag by the Japanese industry, which is fighting a fight that's 10 or 15 years old. So my advice would be, they need to go back to this era where they were looking at these issues, and this agrees with what Stephen said. Be holistic. You've got to have an all-of-government approach. You've got to weigh and balance the pros and the cons. You've got to focus on rooting out the areas where you're actually inefficient. If you're rewarding these zombie companies, and they are zombie companies, and I've met a bunch of them that are continuing to get finance from Japanese banks, don't ask me why, but they do. keeping them alive. There needs to be some focus on that. You need to create some policy coherence and stability, as opposed to this reactive, where you're continuing to invent new policies every month, or every year, and sending all kinds of mixed signals to the sector, which in the sector that has the long runways of research and development this sector does, is very, really undermines risk taking. You need to look at the future tech here and not just what companies are good at now, like regenerative medicine. I mean, there's a lot of technology, and I know that there's work being done at the Japanese universities, but somehow that needs to be commercialized. And finally, you need to focus a lot more on building partnerships with the global ecosystem, including the small and medium-sized enterprises that are doing so much of the research. And as I mentioned, the way that they have altered the price maintenance premium that actually works against that. So I'll just end there. Got lots of war stories, but I won't bore you with those. And look forward to the discussion. Thanks.
I think we look forward to hearing the war stories too. That was excellent, thank you. Let me remind our viewers online that if you would like to ask questions, we welcome you to submit those via the Slido app on the webpage right here. Melanie, what are yours? Thanks.
Great. Okay, thank you so much to Stephen and team with the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation for the invitation to join this panel today. It's really an honor to be here with Andrew and Joe, excellent panelists. So I wanted to share a couple of observations today based on my work at the Asia Group on the political landscape surrounding biopharmaceutical innovation in Japan and how it's shifted in recent years, perhaps offering a slightly optimistic note on the prospects for substantive change in the near term. Based on our work and our interactions with many stakeholders in the ruling Liberal Democratic Party, other parties, and ministries in Japan, we have actually seen a significant number begin to advocate more actively for changes in the system to better foster innovation in pharmaceuticals. Driving this or enabling it is overall stability of the current domestic political landscape. This has really helped open the door to greater advocacy from lawmakers, particularly within the LDP. For example, in the near term. So for example, Prime Minister Fumio Kishida's approval ratings have sort of stabilized at this point and he has leveraged his strengths in international diplomacy over the past several months, with key examples being his trip to Kyiv, his summit with South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol and the rapprochement of that relationship. That's really given him a bit of a boost politically. The LDP as well as in a solid political position. So for now, it looks like potentially a snap election of the lower house does not appear to be on the immediate horizon. What that means in terms of upcoming pharmaceutical reforms is that this environment gives a little bit more flexibility and bandwidth to potential LDP advocates of more innovation-friendly policies to be more outspoken and active and to listen to industry a little bit more. So these LDP figures are now interacting or contending with stakeholders distributed among two other groups we see in this drug pricing policy debate this year within the Ministry of Health, Labor, and Welfare, and then within the Ministry of Finance. So as this report notes, the Ministry of Finance in particular is focused very intensively on cost management in the healthcare system, essentially setting a cap on spending, on social spending overall, and then balancing those costs mainly via drug price compression. So that leaves, as has been touched on in this panel, other stakeholders represented in decision-making on healthcare spending, including within MHLW, among payers, healthcare providers, and others on the Central Social Insurance Medical Council, or CHUIKYO, essentially competing for what's left of the pie. Industry itself is not really represented on CHUIKYO, so in some ways, I think they're simply easier to target and enables the Ministry of Finance and MHLW to lean more, has enabled them to lean a little more heavily on drug price compression for savings, as you mentioned. But turning to the more positive trajectory and momentum we see now, another dynamic potentially driving this momentum is that among industry as well in Japan, we've noted more alignment on proposals and key issues. Whereas previously, say like maybe 4 or 5 years ago-ish, there was more of a sense of divide between foreign companies and organizations and their Japanese counterparts. There's now, we've noted a little bit more alignment, more consensus on the issues that need to be resolved in terms of pricing mechanisms and so on. And that has kind of been met with corresponding interest among lawmakers in hearing what they have to say. Driving a lot of this interest is the widespread recognition that lagging pharmaceutical innovation is a really serious issue for Japan, particularly stemming from Japan's failure to quickly develop an effective COVID vaccine, and as well as the record and expanding trade deficit in pharmaceuticals, which hit 4.6 trillion yen in 2022. So this highlighted the serious challenges in the system and has imbued decision makers and policy influencers with a sense of urgency. And then the Ministry of Health, Labor and Welfare's expert panel, which is currently meeting, we're just wrapping up their work this week. Their expert panel on comprehensive pharmaceutical policy measures has sort of engaged and catalyzed a lot of these concerns, and reports on its potential recommendations that will be submitted to Tokyo to the government suggest that those recommendations may end up going against some of the entrenched interests in the system. So there's a real possibility this year that there could be some positive changes to Japan's pharmaceutical pricing system, and that industry's perspectives could be seriously considered in that process. So as an example, we discussed the price maintenance premium and the recent changes that have particularly dinged new companies, new market entrants that don't have a long legacy in the Japanese market. That's one area where we're hearing that there may be some adjustments that would benefit startups and new market entrants in particular that really drive innovation in the 21st century. There could also be something more structural and comprehensive, but I recommend watching that space. At the same time, I think as Joe kind of mentioned, this lurching approach has been taken to pharmaceutical policies in some respects. That sort of lurching or piecemeal approach does still pose risks. When you start tweaking one part of the system or making ad hoc or in-the-weeds changes, those can have the possibility down the line of hidden or unintentional effects. So one example of an in-the-weeds change that we've seen as something that is going against kind of the innovative goals the government has laid out is this cofactor zero rule, which some of you may be familiar with, but it's intended to promote transparency and cost disclosure for products. Essentially, it adds a coefficient to premiums granted to products for innovation or marketability, and then lowers those premiums if the products have a low cost disclosure rate as part of the pricing process in Japan. The lowest cofactor zero essentially wipes out any premiums awarded to a product. It's even added to products such as those that are part of the Sakigake program, which provides premiums and accelerated approval processes to designated innovative drugs to serve unmet needs. And larger and more established companies can sometimes take or accept that hit, but smaller emerging firms can't. And those are, who those premiums are intended to bring to the market. And as I mentioned, those are the players that are really driving innovation right now. So those kind of small tweaks, if not done very carefully and in a holistic manner, can really undermine goals of achieving and fostering more innovation. And then the broader issues are so this, this pie of social spending, the amount of social spending that the government is allocating there is not getting any bigger for now. While the Ministry of Finance is trying to constrain increasing social security spending, at the same time, the government's increasing spending in other areas like defense quite significantly. And so there are these competing priorities, which lead to a broader debate about how to pay for all of it, including whether, tax increases might be introduced, and that gets into more sensitive political territory. So how to address that with the Ministry of Finance is perhaps beyond the scope of this panel, but it's important to keep in mind in terms of broader political dynamics. At the same time, just to close out, there are a lot of people within the LDP and elsewhere who are serious about figuring these problems out and addressing this innovation challenge in biopharma. So I, for one, am hopeful that we might see some real substantive change during the upcoming price reform round. Japan is certainly not the only country to face sort of demographic challenges and trying to meet all these priorities that they're facing right now. So there's a real opportunity here for a precedent to be set in terms of balancing these factors for better or worse. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Molly. That's great.
Okay.
Andrew.
Oh, yes.
Thank you very much. And it's a pleasure to join the panel and to join last on the heavy lifting that's been done by the experts to the right, which frees me up to sprinkle up a couple of observations that could take the conversation in other directions in the Q&A. I'm coming back, as mentioned, to Japan-US beat after a few years away. And the thing that overwhelms me is how close the alignment is in a whole host of sectors, from security and technology policy, and there are no real commercial issues out there. So this is an interesting reminder for me that we aren't in perfect alignment and perhaps don't want to be. That's the cautionary nature of the story. There's also room for us to get the model right by learning from one another. It's clearly there's some shortcomings in the U.S. model as well. So 3 things that I wanted to mention. First, my own anecdotal experience as a commercial officer, briefly in Japan, but 30 years overseas in a couple of relevant markets, Korea and Germany as well. My main takeaway there from my Japan experience was that it wasn't a linear descent, but as the report mentions, there was an ebb and flow. Things were looking more and less optimistic over time, which is encouraging for the notes of a rebound, which Melody is also highlighting in her comments. Second item I wanted to make were parallels from my most recent experience, which was a couple of years in Taiwan. If anything, I think the Japan model serves as a double cautionary for Taiwan. In some areas, there's even greater challenges in that market where they haven't got the established base in innovation, the infrastructure to go forward, and yet have very high ambitions to find the next engine for Taiwan's innovation and the next export platform. And yet, some of their restrictions on the price side and these other concerns, market access and the like, are even more severe there. So it poses some real questions for Taiwan. And it would be great to also hear in the conversation some markets that are moving more aggressively. Korea and of course China come to mind. And then third and finally, I would just like to pose and learn from the panelists and the group what we can do to go forward on the report, next steps to make sure the lessons are disseminated, what we can do, policymakers and the business communities and my own organization, Japan America Societies, to look for synergies and improve the situation in both markets. So first on my experience, I was reading the report, I was struck by cause and effect. These policy changes, there wasn't that much of a policy lag. The access to the market, U.S. exports really did react relatively rapidly to some of these changes that were made. As I saw it, my time coincided with that brighter period, let's say 2012 to 17. And those were the years when the price maintenance premium was really coming on, very well received, seemed to be having a very positive effect on the U.S. exporters that we were dealing with, the firms in the market, the dynamism of the sector at large. After the pricing, as was reviewed by Stephen in the report and then by Joe, this is the era also where the Sakigake policies were streamlining, were really taking their effect. There was a huge positive buzz about the prospects of regenerative medicine and genomic technologies and cell and gene therapies. Dr. Yamanaka and the Nobel Peace Prize was all coming together then. It really did seem to us at that time that Japan's old mojo was coming back. But at the same time, I recall we were working with some of the worrying signals in that latter part, especially 2015-17. There were the fear that price pressures in the form of biennial reviews coming into annual reviews were going to be coming into place, accelerating the downward pressure. The increased use of reference pricing from other markets, I remember as a concern, and the big concern that the health technology assessment model that was just being tried out wasn't going to be a holistic approach that really took into account the societal value of novel drugs and approaches. So at that time, our section was visited by a lot of the firms represented in the room today, and Joe was certainly there with Bio, bringing delegations out to ring an early bell of caution about the direction that things were going. Commercial section, we were pressed into action to do what we could, talking to NHLW, even the cabinet and MOF at times. We got into the resources issues. It seems like those worries were really well founded because in the 5 or so years since I left, I'm learning that really there has been a deterioration with the policy changes, and that's played out in the statistics that were shown. Another indicator I had was watching outbound FDI flow, because we got increasingly involved in all sectors, but especially life sciences. And there was certainly a corroboration then of what was happening. As we made some reverse missions back to the US with the ambassador, we dropped in on companies like Teramo and learned how well they were doing in the States and why they're doing well. And a lot had to do with the innovation climate, but also the capacity to commercialize innovation, not just leave it with technical innovation. Most recently, since I started this new job, I heard that story again, that we did a business topic webinar with a representative of Stellis USA, Mark Riesenauer, the president of the company. I think they employ 1,200 people by now in the United States. The bulk of their R&D work is being done in the United States, as Mark explained. That was the first of 30 such presentations we've done with Japanese companies in the US from the life sciences sector, which in itself says something, that they kept a lower profile, and there aren't that many of those firms, but those that are in the US seem to be like Stellis doing quite well. In that conversation, we were also paired with an economist who talked about a lot of the other factors which are bedeviling the Japanese innovation framework in life sciences, such as, again, Stephen mentioned, but the failure to really exploit the open innovation model seemed to be the strongest of those. Second, real quickly, what did I observe in Taiwan? There are many structural, regulatory, and even cultural parallels, it seems, with Japan. More importantly, perhaps more ominously, Japan is often a policy model for Taiwan. Like Japan, we've got an economy with a low birth rate, rapidly aging population, universal health care system, but real budgetary constraints. And Melody was mentioning the competing priorities in Japan. Again, for a rare time, both of those are defense spending is one of the area being pointed to for a fresh source of crowding out potential resources for this sector. So lots of challenges in Taiwan. And Taiwan is not a biopharmaceuticals or healthcare market where total cost is considered, but rather short-term cost minimization seems to be the name of the game. So tied to the low investment in healthcare, and we've got stagnating investment in this area, 6.5% for over a decade now, it's created a situation where the payers' hands are tied and access to the most innovative and effective treatments are being delayed or plainly not reimbursed at all. Major differences with Japan, if my understanding is correct, is that while Japan applies the downward drug cost pressure, it mostly reimburses in line with the regulatory label, the approved indications of usage. While in Taiwan, there's a much more significant gap between reimbursed and approved usages for innovative medicines in that market. So that's a real counter-incentive, obviously, for the most innovative pharma to see Taiwan as a long-term strategic market. It also puts public health outcomes at risk. Just for one example, in the oncology area I heard about, by utilizing the most innovative therapies in the early disease setting could be curative and therefore very cost-effective. In Taiwan, they reimburse with a cost-centric treat-to-fail approach. That is, they might start with older generations of drugs and work their way to costlier, more innovative medicines as they fail, and unfortunately, cancer progresses. Last but not least, it creates an inequitable healthcare environment as the most affluent members of society can procure innovation earlier on out-of-pocket expenditures. So many of the same challenges were also seen on the med tech and the device side as well, which raises some questions about the broader innovation model. Taiwan, like Japan, is well poised for homegrown innovation, outstanding clinical skills, dealing with cutting-edge procedures and to spark innovation. highly capable manufacturing base that could be pretty readily deployed into the sector. But there seems to be relatively little happening at the grassroots in both places, although I think Japan clearly is far ahead of it. So those are the 2 points, and then the last piece was moving forward and efforts at restoring Japan's leadership in innovation. That was the title of the discussion that we had with Astellas recently, and Richard Katz was the economist who offered his observations in the area. In the interest of time, just again to recap, open innovation, university cooperation were again mentioned, but so too were U.S. venture capital and private equity activity moving into Japan as a partial support, as well as direct investment by U.S. firms, particularly into SMEs in Japan, perhaps being part of the solution of some of the succession issues that we are familiar with. So there, I'd like to conclude my comments and say thanks.
Andrew, that was great. Thank you. Well, all right. Encourage those watching online to submit those questions via Slido. We'll open it up, of course, to the audience here as well. But maybe we'll just start by asking the panelists if they would like to react to anything they heard from a fellow panelist.
I could just underline Andrew's point about, in terms of what we can do and for next steps, underlying that point about the importance of, funding and potentially there's easier private equity for startups in Japan as part of efforts to invigorate that ecosystem and build innovation. I mean, I think there's just a hesitancy towards kind of longer term risk taking that is needed given clinical trial lengths and all the risks that perhaps are perceived to come with investments into healthcare related startups. So bringing in some of that additional funding from the US rather than forcing Japanese firms to go abroad to look for that funding, I think would be a good step in that direction.
I would just add to pick up a point that Andrew made. But it's interesting that the other major economies of East Asia did sort of imitate Japan's mistakes. I've been spending some time looking at this. They all had similar healthcare systems. They were all dominated by the Ministry of Health. And industrial policy was actually dominated by the Ministry of Health perspective. Ministries of Health are, I think, necessarily and notoriously domestic agencies. They're inward looking. They're not exactly the best position to make an industry global. And in the case of Japan, certainly Taiwan, and until maybe more recently Korea and China, they all did that though. And even though you can name world leading companies in tech or autos in most of those countries, can't really name life sciences like top 2, top 3 leaders in any of those markets, at least not yet. And so there's some lessons to be learned that go beyond simply what Japan did, because it was imitated by a lot of its neighbors. I do think that creates some opportunities though in today's the way the industry works today. I would say that 20 years ago when I started here, scale was a big factor for getting into the sector, and the largest 10 American firms were 10 times larger than the largest Japanese firms, much less firms in Taiwan or Korea. But now there's a lot of opportunity for smaller players, small, medium-sized enterprises in biotech. If you can put those structures together, finance and, as was mentioned, academic and commercial cooperation. So all is not lost. And it also means, by the way, I think that the U.S. needs to be on its toes too, because the sector is changing. I think you are starting, if you look at exports, just of those 4 economies, Japan, Taiwan, Korea, and China in the sector, Japan and Taiwan are flat. I mean, it's as if, for 20 years flat. And in real dollar and nominal terms too, it's not even like rising with inflation. Korea has made some interesting plays because it's got some world leading companies like Samsung and LG. in the biosimilar space. And that was a really interesting strategy. We'll see if they can go beyond that. China has been just pouring tens and hundreds of billions of dollars into the sector. They have a big, large local market, but their exports are starting to go up too. A lot of that's in the not necessarily as advanced areas, but they're starting to break out a little bit of all of this. So it'll be interesting to see. But those are all challenges for Japan as well, because nobody's standing still.
Japan, like many countries, is not like the United States in the sense that, any regulatory announcement is not posted in the Federal Register or, if you want RFI comment for stakeholder level weigh in on, is there policy environment in Japan? So the question is, what are the most effective way for stakeholders to provide their input to Japanese policymakers who are weighing these issues? And B, what messages do you think resonate most strongly and effectively when we're trying to make the broad argument to appropriately value their messages?
So the question is, what are the best ways for private sector stakeholders to
How do we
convey their perspectives? And it's a big question. I think my head is going in a lot of directions in terms of recommendations, but I think acknowledgement of some of the difficulties and challenges of Japan's kind of budget situation and some of the constraints around pricing is good. I think the situations are grouped a little bit in terms of the amount of transparency and willingness of government stakeholders to interact with industry. So some of that direct outreach to particularly entrepreneurial lawmakers can sometimes be interesting, as well as to different advocacy groups based on specific issues related to drugs, specific drugs in portfolio, and so on and so forth, as well as some of the more public-facing advocacy that makes a case for why a certain change is important to a broader audience, rather than just the ones that feel like they're already immersed in the world of pharmaceutical policy. So extending that argument out a little bit if appropriate would be the way to go about it.
I was going to note again that for a lot of years, I don't know if this was optimal or it simply didn't work, that the industry, the American industry and the European industry too, by the way, asked for a lot of help from their governments to get them a seat at the table in Japan, and that there were bilateral processes set up going all the way back to the Reagan administration in the pharma sector and medtech sector too, to do that, to give us some points, because typically the Japanese government, like a lot of other governments, is more interested in its own indigenous stakeholders. I think, and so that it did become a sort of an annual part of annual trade discussions between the two governments, and that did have some impact on it. I really do believe, on the reforms that were made beginning in even before 2012. So that's one thing I would say. Second thing I would say is two other quick points. One is, who is the audience here too? It's difficult to communicate with. I think the parties that are losing, but they don't know necessarily, are Japanese patients. That's a difficult audience to reach. So the industry did it for legal reasons and for cultural reasons. But the problem is that you're talking primarily in the Ministry of Health, which has a particular perspective on things, and sometimes that's frustrating, and it's not necessarily going to lead to fast change. So that's another problem that you have. And I'm trying to think of what the third point I had was, because I had a really good one. I would say this is the other thing, in terms of who's considered a stakeholder in Japan, because again, it goes to that voice. Traditionally, and again, a lot of other governments work this way. To be considered a stakeholder in Japan, you have to be invested in Japan. So when I worked with pharma, the big pharma companies have been there for many, many years, 50 years or more. And, so they were their country president, or sometimes a senior executive would come in from outside, and they would get an audience with the Minister of Health, other officials. But going back to the reality of today's world, what Japan really needs to do, if you want to go international, is it's networking, okay? These skill sets, this production, this innovation is all networked, okay? But it's very difficult for the, and when I was representing Bio, I was trying to, in a sense, represent the network. Like, these people aren't in Japan, and that's exactly the problem. You want them to be here. I found it wasn't done that much, but what was sort of interesting when we go there, we bring CEOs from small biotech companies, they would say to Japanese officials, if you stop doing this, like the price maintenance premium that you have to, have previous product launched in Japan, we will come here, we will do research and development. So the problem is that if you've got, there aren't stakeholders, and nor is there a stakeholder in the sort of broader life sciences industry. Japan's biotech sector, so to speak, it exists, but it's quite weak. And it's much weaker than, say, the middle group of companies that are producing non-innovative products, who employ thousands, there's hundreds of those companies, and they employ thousands of people. Japan's much more concerned about preserving their jobs and listening to them than it is this non-existent or very tiny constituency. And that requires, I go back to this, a little bit of forward thinking about, is it the industry you have, or is it the industry that you want that matters?
Great. Any questions from our audience here in person? Excellent. If you would just identify yourself and the organization you're with.
Sure, my name is Alex Mello. I'm a senior associate at the Asia Group. I work for Melanie. I had a question in terms of mechanisms for industry discussions and conversations. In 2021, the new pharma vision was updated the first time, I think, since 2013. It was a big deal, a lot of excitement around this, but since 2021, we haven't really heard much active or action around that pharma vision 2021. Do you think that is still a mechanism for industries to engage with, or is that kind of been shelved by the government? Caveat to that, though, is what's seeming like the success of the MHLW's expert panel seems to maybe have come out of that vision, but it seems like that's still an unused tool. Would like your thoughts on that.
Do you want to take on Iman?
I can defer to my CFO.
Yeah, I that's a really great question. First of all, every few years Japan puts out one of these strategies, and there's just this amazing slide deck with flow charts that I can't really understand very well.
Best slides in the
with
world.
the squares and the arrows and the circles and all that, and I'm sure they're very brilliant. And then sometimes they do sit on the shelf for a number of years. Sometimes they don't. Sometimes they do because the resources haven't really been allocated. It's just a plan. Sometimes they sit on the shelf because to really be effective, it requires interagency cooperation, and that hasn't really been developed, and it has to be. So that's an impediment to the plan. I always think that there's some good thinking in those plans, though, and that from perspective of, I always felt like from a perspective of a foreigner, in going to Japan and talking to them about these issues, that anytime that you could point to the fact that these ideas were not your ideas, because there's always this assumption that they're self-serving when you come in as an American or European, that it was actually the government that agreed that this was the right policy direction, that at least you can have some credibility that way. So I think that there's still good to point to, and I think that if they haven't been followed through on, that's an additional point that actually should be made.
Any that one?
No, I mean, I think that says something.
Yeah, Chris Caldwell with MSD. If I'm correct, I think you did a little bit of a tour in Japan of the findings. I'm just curious, what reactions have you received from your discussions with people in Japan?
So I met with 5 parliamentarians, and I would say 4 of them were quite sympathetic to the arguments I was putting forward. And particularly, the last individual was the representative of the LPD on the LMHW, and I think that, I mean, I think they were really saddened by the domestic industry's ability to develop COVID-19 vaccine. Yeah, I think that really has animated attention and energy that perhaps the policy choices have caused the industry to languish or to suffer more than no one is really understood or anticipated policymakers. So every time I met, I would take every time I met with every single policymaker, they're like, this is a real national concern for us, and we recognize that we have to better support this industry's ability to innovate going forward. So that was my question. Also, I think I mean the point I was trying to make, and this might be too naive or too American, but it's like talking to a company in a tough economic time. Like, you have to adopt a growth mindset. Like, a lot of people talk about the innovation paradox or taking risks, and the whole point, like, you look at Kodak and their decline. They went from the all-time high of the stock price and of sales of revenues, 1999, $16 billion to bankruptcy 13 years later. And the point was, as the new technologies were invented, they stopped to invest in R&D, they stopped to invest in innovation. They got caught in kind of a mindset of contraction. Whereas the only choice in that environment is growth, right? Is innovation. And so I'm trying to, this is an industry that can be an economic growth driver for you. This industry can generate employment, tax revenues, and help get you out of the broader box you find yourself in with the declining overall budgetary revenue. So, and I think there was some recognition from policymakers that yeah, broadly that's the kind of mindset Japan has, and not just for this sector itself, but for the all broader economy, because that's the only way down the box.
Thank you.
Introduce yourself. Introduce yourself.
Yeah, Jim Pottery with Geography. Thanks, Stephen, for the excellent review of the report, and to all the panelists. Really good commentary. One of the things that strikes me across from beginning to end is the sense of time. So you've taken this long time horizon and looked at the decline of the industry. But I want to pick up on a couple of things that the panelists said. Andrew, you mentioned your sense of responsiveness, or how quickly things could be responded to in terms of policy change, in terms of positive impact. And I think Melanie also highlighted the looming increase in defense spending. And so we've got these two things coming together in ways I think that are really precipitous for Japan unless they move very quickly, because the doubling of defense spending will take a lot of discretionary spending away. There'll be enormous pressure on the social security system. And so I think one of the things to take away and perhaps emphasize going forward, in the spirit of Joe's good comments on policy coherence, is how to tie that all together with the urgency of the moment, because there could be a good turnaround in a couple of years' time if a concentrated effort is made in a way with your optimism about stakeholders and the diet. I think those people really need to be addressed in a way that does bring to them the sense of urgency here, but also the sense of possibility. That's more a comment than a question, but feel free to pick up on any of that.
No, I think it's a good point, Jared, that, and I think it also makes sense. I mean, it's obvious why Japan feels it needs to spend more money on defense. No one's going to second guess that. But it should also be, I mean, there are also some bigger picture compelling points. Obviously, otherwise it should be spending more on healthcare innovation. And it is because of the demographics, right? I mean, and having a healthy society, and people who, Japanese people are already the longest lived in the world, but you need productive, people too. to be contributing to the economy. So, there's strategic reasons for investing more in the life sciences sector that I think need to be. It's just not really clear who to talk to at that. And it has to be, I suppose, at the prime minister level, because the Ministry of Health, that's their purview, but they think in very tactical day-to-day terms, and they have an annual budget, and no one's really thinking about this, like what's our future, in terms of the future strategically, where do we want to be? It's tough to find, and maybe but it's tough to find those people who both have some, that aren't academics, that who kind of get it and have the ability to sort of move policy in that direction.
I wondered if
I just add a quick point. I think there is an intersection too now between, health security and economic security and the drive for those both in the US and Japan. In Japan so far, pharmaceutical supplies are part of that sort of economic security bucket. We're seeing, funding going more towards like production of antibiotics in Japan, or production of dual use facilities that can switch to vaccine production in a crisis. But there is the risk there too of that taking on that sort of reactive approach that we've discussed, where they're kind of responding to shoring that certain supply chains or making them more resilient, or cutting off certain supplies to other actors that, may in the end maybe more of a kind of retrospective focus on what we have now that we need to protect or ensure that we have access to, versus being more competitive in the future in areas like biopharmaceuticals and biotech. So there is a bit of a risk there, but that can be kind of a broader framework through which to look at, health security and innovation.
Two quick reactions on resources and timing. The first one is a flip a question back to the group. Are we making enough headway on the argument about a true societal value calculation for the budget for these finite resources? And then secondly, go back to that point again about pie not being so finite, if you are able to structure this right, that you create a growth dynamo for the sector, you can actually grow society's resources.
Thank you. Take an online question briefly. Why should Americans shoulder the cost of higher drug prices to pay for drug innovations that everyone benefits from? How can the United States prevail on other countries to pay more too?
That is a great question. Well, I think we're talking here about one way of doing it, which is Americans do, I think it can be argued, disproportionately support the global innovation that's happening in the world. And but it has its positive impact too, which is we also have the world's leading biopharmaceutical sector, which develops most of the drugs in the world, and including cures. And as you just discussed today, Stephen, Japan has fallen behind, Europe has fallen behind. So I think going around and it's not necessarily technically wrong to call these other countries free riders on American innovation, but I don't think that's the way you persuade people either, because I've tried. So, I think it has to be, this is in your interest too, and here's why. Because you want to be part. This is going to be the quintessential, one of the quintessential technologies of the 21st century. And are you going to be a leader in that, or are you going to let leadership continue where it is? And for America to build strength on strength, it's not necessarily a bad thing. I think the challenge really is that Americans are getting frustrated with the situation, and they recognize it. And if America begins to emulate some of the policies that other countries have put in place, it's really the last bastion of innovation.
Or the end of their last report.
Yeah.
That's exactly. I think, from the ITF perspective, the broader debate really isn't about about price controls isn't really one about whether society wants lower prices in exchange for lower drug company profits. It's about whether society wants lower drug prices in exchange for less and slower drug innovation. That is cheaper prices today, but less effective drugs or slower results. We got just we see that problem part of the equation, not realizing, to your point, the whole economics of biopharmaceutical innovation, the dynamic impact on our ability to bring new drugs forward in the future. Which, when you look at the country that has circled the square on the ability to manage long-term drug prices over time, and in fact, drug prices have decreased net on net as a share of what consumers pay over the past 20 years. To do that, to be the first country in the world to bring innovative drugs to their citizenry and support an innovative industry, I think we should be seen as a place to be more pointing from than rather than we are protecting our citizens extremely right now. I have one final question. Please go ahead. We'll take 2 more questions and we'll wrap up.
Sure. Haley Hutchison, the Japan Center for International Exchange. So, we talked a little bit about Japan's response to the COVID-19 pandemic, whether or not it was creating any innovations throughout the pandemic. And, Japan's hosting the G7 this year. Some of the topics of global health are on the agenda. Prime Minister Kishida also laid out some of these ideas for global health in his comment in The Lancet a few months ago. But I just wanted to know kind of the panel's perspective on, what might be your messages to the Japanese government and, that in the innovation space about, encouraging this sort of innovation in regards to pandemic preparedness, or, what might be any sort of future pandemic. And yes, so that's my question.
I'll say one quick piece. I think it's really important to focus on win-win solutions, which is kind of a cliche, but what I mean is that there were a lot of countries, including Japan, I think, that really, and including our own, that really started to think about whether they need to be sort of self-sufficient in a lot of medicines. And I can kind of see that point, but really what's important, and I think a lot of responsible parties said this, is to have resilient supply chains globally. And if really need to resist the temptation to react to some of these challenges by more inward-looking, go it alone type policies, and keeping the global supply chain open. That's actually the best, and also, by the way, the most economical. I mean, if every country in the world develops its own vaccine factories, that's one great way to increase the price of vaccines to everybody, as opposed to having a couple of big producers who are doing it safely and under FDA supervision. So I think finding solutions in a collaborative way is really going to be important. But when crisis hits, you can see it in the case of COVID. People do start to think about, oh my God, this did resonate in Japan, and in China, why do we have our own vaccine and everything? And I'm not saying that you don't have to be prepared, but that the global solutions need to be collaborative. The other thing that they did not really do very well, I think they tried, but is think about how to get medicines to developing countries, rich countries, to try to do that. There's a COVAX thing set up at the end, again, very slow and cumbersome. And so it's really important to learn those lessons. I think to really think about what was done, learn those lessons, and to keep the global trading system open.
And as we move, from the exigency of the current pandemic to thinking about pandemic preparedness for the future, we would counsel at ITAF that it's vitally important to recognize that far from being a barrier to access to medicines, intellectual property is fundamentally there in need. And that access to medicines depends on the existence of medicines in the first place. And so we would encourage countries to oppose a waiver expansion of the COVID-19 IPR vaccines waiver to therapeutics and diagnostics, recognizing that it was IP. That, if IP was ever a problem during the pandemic, it was only that initially we didn't have the know-how, knowledge, and technology that is the intellectual property necessary to make novel vaccines and medicines. Once we had the IP and scale it, and be better at getting it, we get clawbacks. But really, the IP became a critical enabler of the voluntary licensing agreements that enable us to rapidly scale the manufacturing of vaccines and diagnostics. So, looking at pandemic preparedness, I would council policymakers to see, IP and its protections are part of this decision. One other thing I think is important for Japan is I was interviewed with some TV station asked about the new $88 billion innovation fund, the university fund, and what the U.S. has done so well in its innovation system, especially in life sciences, but more broadly, is fund university research, private investigators at universities, give universities rights to the intellectual property that stem from that federally funded R&D, and then license it out to new companies. And so the impact of academic university technology transfer has led to 13,000 new companies over the past 2 decades, hundreds of new drugs, hundreds of thousands of patents, and of course, as well as talking about Bio Act. So for Japanese policymakers, I think really to turn their universities into engines of innovation, and to do so by creating pathways for commercialization of technologies and bring industry and university close together. And that's more probably than the pandemic, but I think that's one of the biggest things Japan can do to turbocharge broader innovation ecosystem.
On the vaccine too, isn't there a great example? Joe was mentioning country level collaboration in the sector, but intra-firm, that's a great chance to make the point for open innovation when you think of Pfizer BioNTech and where the first novel vaccine came from and what kind of system ecosystem allowed it to come about.
Well, great. Any final questions from the audience? Any final remarks from our panelists? All right, well, with that, I want to thank our audience for being here in person and online today. And I want to ask you to help me thank this great panel for a discussion on Japan's life sciences innovation system. We'll have video of this event up on our YouTube website and online by this afternoon. So please feel free to share it with your colleagues. Thank you.